March 14, 1970, 2:47 in the morning. Strategic Air Command Headquarters, Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. In a windowless operations room 3 floors below ground, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Murray stood before a wall-size status board tracking every SR-71 Blackbird in the inventory. 28 airframes total. 11 mission-capable at that precise moment. The rest were down, some for scheduled depot maintenance, others awaiting parts that took weeks to fabricate, and 3 grounded by fuel leaks that no amount of sealant could fix permanently. The room smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A bank of teletypes clattered along the far wall, spitting out status updates from Beale Air Force Base in California, Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, and Royal Air Force Mildenhall in England. Each update tracked a single variable, tanker availability. Murray had heard the jokes. The Blackbird was the fastest, highest-flying reconnaissance platform ever built, 3.2 Mach. 85,000 feet, untouchable. The Soviets had fired hundreds of surface-to-air missiles at SR-71s over the years. Not one had connected. The airplane was, in the common phrase, too first to catch. But standing in that operations room, Murray knew something the public did not. The SR-71 was not operationally invincible because of its speed. It was operationally fragile. So fragile that every sortie required a choreographed aerial ballet involving multiple tanker aircraft, precise timing windows measured in minutes, and fuel offload rates that left almost no margin for error. The airplane leaked fuel on the ground, it burned fuel at staggering rates at high speed, and if even one aerial refueling failed, if a valve stuck, if a boom operator misjudged closure, if weather forced a tanker off its track, the mission aborted and the crew faced the very real possibility of flameout over hostile territory. The telephone on Murray's desk rang. He picked up. A voice from the command post at Beale reported that one of the KCA C-135Q tankers, assigned to support an upcoming Arctic surveillance mission, had blown a hydraulic pump during pre-flight. The backup tanker was still 3 hours from being fueled and ready. The SR-71 crew was already in pressure suits, waiting. Without that tanker, the mission could not launch. What they feared was the missile. What actually limited them was the gas station. If you genuinely value carefully researched, long-form historical documentaries that go beyond the surface narrative, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this kind of detailed work truly resonates with you. Chapter 1. The Public Myth and the Private Reality. By March 1970, the SR-71 had been operational for nearly 4 years. It had replaced the U-2 for overflights of hostile territory. Not because the U-2 was obsolete, but because Gary Powers had been shot down over Sverdlovsk in May 1960, and President Eisenhower had promised no more manned overflights of the Soviet Union. The SR-71 skirted that promise by flying so high and so fast that Soviet interceptors could not reach it, and surface-to-air missiles arrived too late. In the press, the airplane was a technological marvel. Lockheed Skunk Works, under the direction of legendary designer Clarence Kelly Johnson, had designed an airframe that could withstand sustained flight at temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The structure was 92% titanium by weight at a time when most aircraft used aluminum. The engines, Pratt & Whitney J58 turbojets with bypass ducts that transitioned to ramjet mode at high Mach, produced 34,000 pounds of thrust each at maximum power. The fuel, JP7, had a flash point so high it would not ignite if you dropped a lit match into it. The airplane was built largely of titanium, sourced covertly from the Soviet Union through shell companies, because the United States did not produce enough high-grade titanium domestically in the early 1960s. Johnson later acknowledged the irony in his memoir. The airplane designed to spy on the Soviets was built from Soviet metal. The public narrative was speed equals invulnerability. In reality, speed equaled extreme logistical dependence. Consider the basic operational profile. An SR-71 sortie from Beale Air Force Base in California to photograph Soviet installations along the Kola Peninsula required at least 6 aerial refuelings, in 2 shortly after takeoff to top off the tanks after the fuel-intensive climb to altitude, 2 more en route, and 2 on the return leg. Each refueling required the SR-71 to slow to approximately 0.9 Mach and descend to 25 to 30,000 feet, where the air was dense enough for the tanker to operate but thin enough that the Blackbird's engines would not flame out from lack of airspeed. The refueling altitude was itself a compromise. Too high, and the KC-1035Q tanker could not maintain controlled flight. Its wings were optimized for lower altitudes, and the thin air at 35,000 feet left little margin between stall speed and maximum safe speed. Too low, and the SR-71's engines became unstable. The J-58 was a finicky power plant at subsonic speeds and low altitudes. It wanted to be at altitude, flying fast, where the ram air effect through the inlet spike provided most of the thrust. Down at 28,000 feet, crawling along at 0.9 Mach behind a tanker, the engines ran rough, compressor stalls were common, and pilots had to nurse the throttles constantly to keep both engines lit. The tanker aircraft, initially KC-135Q Stratotankers, a specialized variant equipped to carry JP-7, had to position themselves along the route with extraordinary precision. A tanker off station by even 50 miles could force the SR-71 to divert, burning fuel it did not have to spare. And the refueling itself was a high-stakes operation. The boom operator in the tanker's tail had to guide a rigid aerial refueling boom into a receptacle on the SR-71's upper fuselage, while both aircraft flew through turbulence at closing speeds that left seconds to react. If the boom struck the Blackbird's fuselage outside the receptacle, it could puncture the skin, causing a catastrophic fuel leak. Or, former SR-71 pilot Brian Shull described the refueling process in his memoir, Sled Driver. The approach was flown on instruments because the SR-71's nose-high attitude during refueling blocked the pilot's forward view entirely. The reconnaissance systems officer in the backseat called out distances and closure rates based on radar returns. The tanker's boom operator provided constant radio updates. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, contact in 3, 2, 1. Contact. The metallic thunk of boom to receptacle contact reverberated through both airframes. If the connection was good, fuel began flowing immediately at a rate of 6,000 pounds per minute. If the connection was marginal, if the latches did not fully engage, fuel pressure dropped, flow slowed, and the boom operator had to disconnect and try again. Each attempt burned fuel the SR-71 could not spare. The SR-71 community did not advertise these vulnerabilities. Operational security demanded silence. The Air Force publicly emphasized the airplane's speed and altitude performance. Press releases celebrated successful reconnaissance missions. Briefings to congressional committees highlighted the intelligence value of SR-71 imagery. But within Strategic Air Command, the tanker coordination problem was well understood. In a 1972 after-action report, Major General John Murphy, commander of the 9th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Beale, wrote that the KCV-2 fleet represented a single point of failure for the entire SR-71 program. If tanker availability dropped below a certain threshold, due to maintenance, weather, or enemy action, SR-71's sortie rates would collapse. Murphy recommended increasing the KC-135Q fleet from 56 to 75 aircraft and establishing emergency tanker reserves at forward operating locations. The recommendation was not funded. The reason was cost. Each KC-135Q cost approximately $23 million to modify from a standard K. CZ cost $180 million in current terms. The modifications included separate fuel tanks for JP-7, upgraded pumps capable of handling JP-7's viscosity, special filtration systems to prevent contamination, and reinforced plumbing throughout. A standard KC-135 could not carry JP-7 without these modifications. The fuel would corrode seals, clog filters, and eventually damage pumps. And converting an existing KCC-135 to Q model standard required the airplane to be pulled from service for 6 months of depot-level work. Strategic Air Command needed those tankers for other missions. The budget did not exist to build more. Chapter 2. Why the Blackbird leaked. The SR-71's fuel leak problem was not a flaw. It was a design compromise necessitated by the laws of physics. At cruise speed, Mach 3.2, the airframe heated to over 500 degrees Fahrenheit from aerodynamic friction. The leading edges of the wings reached over 900 degrees. The titanium skin expanded by several inches in all directions. A panel 100 inches long, at room temperature, grew to 100.8 inches at cruise temperature. The expansion was not uniform. Different parts of the airframe heated at different rates. The nose, which bore the brunt of the ram air, heated faster than the aft fuselage. The upper surfaces, exposed to direct sunlight at altitude, heated faster than the lower surfaces, which radiated heat into the cold stratosphere. If the fuel tanks had been sealed tightly enough to prevent leaks at room temperature, the thermal expansion at cruise altitude would have buckled the structure. The panels would have warped, the stringers would have bent. The airframe would have failed, so Lockheed's engineers designed the tanks to leak on the ground. The panels fit loosely when cold. At temperature, they expanded into a tight seal. This was not a guess. It was calculated precisely. Lockheed built full-scale test articles and heated them in specialized ovens to measure thermal expansion coefficients. The engineers determined that the panels needed approximately 0.05 inches of clearance at room temperature to achieve proper fit at cruise temperature. That clearance allowed fuel to seep through the joints, not pour seep. The fuel dribbled out slowly, forming small puddles under the wings and fuselage. But it never pooled significantly because JP7 evaporated relatively quickly, even at ambient temperatures. The vapor was visible as a shimmer in the air behind the airplane. Ground crews working near an SR-71 on a hot day could smell the fuel, a sweet, kerosene-like odor that lingered. This created an operational constraint. The SR-71 could not taxi to the runway with full tanks. It carried only enough fuel to take off, climb to altitude, and rendezvous with the first tanker. Ground crews filled the tanks to approximately 40% capacity, roughly 30 to 5,000 pounds of JP7 out of a total capacity of 80,000 pounds. The rest came from the tanker. Former SR-71 pilot Colonel Richard Graham described the takeoff procedure in his memoir, SR-71 Revealed. The airplane left a trail of fuel droplets on the taxiway. Puddles formed under the wings during pre-flight. The fuel vaporized before it could pool. JP7's high flash point made it relatively safe, but the visual effect was unsettling. Pilots joked that you could follow an SR-71 to the runway by the wet spots on the concrete. Graham recalled his first SR-71 flight. They briefed me on the fuel leaks. I thought they were exaggerating. Then I walked out to the airplane and saw fuel dripping from half a dozen panel joints. I asked the crew chief if this was normal. He said, "Sir, if it's not leaking, it's not going to seal at altitude." That was not reassuring. Once airborne, the clock started. The airplane climbed at maximum thrust, burning fuel at nearly 3,000 pounds per minute. The engines were optimized for high-altitude, high-speed flight. At low altitude and low speed, they were profoundly inefficient. The inlet spike position was critical. At subsonic speeds, the spike extended fully forward to allow maximum airflow into the engine, but this configuration created drag and limited thrust. The SR-71 had to reach the first tanker within 20 minutes of takeoff, or it would not have enough fuel to complete the refueling and continue the mission. The first refueling, called the departure refueling, typically occurred over the Pacific Ocean, 200 miles west of the California coast, or over the North Sea if launching from Mildenhall. The tanker orbited in a racetrack pattern at 28,000 feet. The SR-71 climbed to meet it, still subsonic, engines screaming, fuel gauges dropping. The boom operator watched the Blackbird approach through a small window in the tanker's tail. The SR-71's nose rode high during refueling, obscuring the pilot's forward view. The approach was flown on instruments, guided by radio calls from the boom operator, Blackbird, tanker. You're cleared to contact position. Closure looks good. 40 feet. 30, 20. Standby. Contact. The offload took 12 to 15 minutes. The tanker transferred approximately 40,000 pounds of JP7, filling the SR-71's tanks to near capacity. The Blackbird then disconnected, accelerated to cruise speed, and climbed to altitude. The tanker descended and returned to base. The SR-71 continued toward its surveillance area, now at Mach 3+ and 80,000 feet, where the sky turned dark purple and the curvature of the Earth became visible. If the refueling failed, if the boom would not connect, if turbulence knocked the aircraft apart, if the tanker had a fuel pump failure, the SR-71 had two options. It could attempt to reach an alternate tanker if one was available within range, or it could abort, descend, and divert to the nearest suitable airfield. In either case, the mission was over. The intelligence that Sortie was supposed to collect went uncollected. Satellite passes would have to be retasked. Other collection assets would have to fill the gap. And somewhere in Washington, an intelligence analyst would note that the SR-71 had failed to deliver, again because of a mundane logistics failure that had nothing to do with enemy action. Chapter 3. The tanker force nobody talks about. The KC-135Q was not a glamorous airplane. It was a militarized Boeing 707, modified to carry and transfer fuel in flight. The Air Force operated 56 KC-135Qs specifically for the SR-71 program, a tiny fraction of the overall KC-135 fleet, which numbered over 700 aircraft. But the Q model was not interchangeable with standard KC-135s. It carried JP7, which required separate plumbing, pumps, and filtration systems. A standard KC-135 carried JP4, a kerosene-based fuel that would cause an SR-71's engines to fail within minutes. JP7 was a problem in itself. It was expensive to produce, difficult to handle, and incompatible with most standard aviation fuel infrastructure. The flash point, the temperature at which the fuel would ignite, was 140 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to 110 degrees for JP4 and 110 degrees for standard automotive gasoline. This high flash point made JP7 safer to store and handle, but it also made it harder to ignite in an engine. The J58 engines required a chemical ignition system using triethyl borane, a substance that ignited spontaneously on contact with air. Each engine carried enough triethylborane for about 20 ignitions. Once exhausted, the airplane had to return to base for servicing. The Strategic Air Command maintained KC-135Q detachments at every location where SR-71s operated. Beale Air Force Base in California, Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, RAF Mildenhall in England. Each detachment kept at least 4 tankers on alert status, fueled and ready to launch within 2 hours. For a single SR-71 sortie, SAC typically allocated 4 to 6 tankers, 2 for the departure refueling, 2 for mid-mission refuelings, and 1 or 2 as airborne spares in case of mechanical failure. The logistics were staggering. Each tanker carried approximately 150,000 pounds of JP7. An SR-71 required roughly 80,000 pounds per sortie. But that fuel had to come from multiple tankers positioned along the route. If the mission profile called for 6 refuelings, SAC had to pre-position 6 tankers, each at a specific latitude and longitude, at a specific time with a specific fuel load. Weather delays, mechanical problems, or navigation errors could cascade through the entire chain. The tankers did not orbit randomly. They flew precise racetrack patterns defined by geographic coordinates, magnetic headings, and timing windows. A typical refueling track was 10 miles long and 2 miles wide. The tanker flew one direction for 5 minutes, turned 180 degrees, flew the opposite direction for 5 minutes, and repeated. The SR-71 approached from behind and below, climbing to refueling altitude as it closed on the tanker. If the timing was perfect, the SR-71 arrived just as the tanker completed a turn and steadied on its outbound leg. If the timing was off, if the SR-71 arrived during the turn, or if the tanker was on the wrong leg of the pattern, the refueling could not proceed safely, and both aircraft had to break off and try again. Each attempt burned fuel neither could afford to waste. Colonel Thomas Pugh, who commanded the Strategic Air Command's Refueling Operations Division in the early 1970s, later testified before a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee that SR-71 support consumed roughly 20% of SAC's total tanker hours, despite the Blackbird fleet representing less than 1% of SAC's reconnaissance assets. The airplane was, in his words, a voracious consumer of support resources. Pugh argued that the KC-135Q fleet needed to be expanded, or the SR-71 sortie rate would have to be reduced. His testimony was classified at the time, and only declassified in 2012, long after the SR-71 had been retired. The boom operators who refueled SR-71s were specialists within a specialty. They trained extensively on SR-71 refuelings because the Blackbird's approach profile was unlike any other aircraft. Most receivers, fighters, bombers, other tankers, approached from behind and slightly below, maintaining a steady position while the boom operator flew the boom down into the receptacle. The SR-71 approached the same way, but its high angle of attack during refueling meant the receptacle was nearly horizontal, not tilted upward like most receivers. The boom had to extend almost fully to reach the receptacle, leaving little margin for error. And the SR-71's closing speed was faster than other receivers because the airplane had to maintain a certain minimum speed to keep its engines from flaming out. The boom itself was a marvel of precision engineering. It was a rigid, telescoping tube approximately 50 feet long when fully extended. Small wings, ruddervators at the aft end provided fine control. The boom operator flew it using a small joystick mounted on the control panel in the tanker's tail compartment. The operator lay prone, looking through a small window directly at the receiver. Crosshairs etched into the window helped with aim. Lights on the tanker's underside illuminated the boom and the receiver's upper fuselage, but at night, or in weather, visibility was limited. The operator relied on feel as much as sight, the resistance as the boom nozzle contacted the receptacle, the slight vibration as the latches engaged, the change in hydraulic pressure as fuel began flowing. A former boom operator, Master Sergeant Dale Watkins, recalled refueling SR-71s over the North Sea in the mid-1970s. You could see them coming from 10 miles out, he said in a 1996 oral history interview preserved at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Just a dark shape against the clouds, moving faster than anything else in the sky. They'd slow down to meet us, and you could hear the engines throttle back over the intercom, this deep, pulsing roar that came through the airframe. Then they'd slide into position, and you had maybe 30 seconds to get the boom in. If you missed, they didn't have the fuel to wait around for you to try again. I refueled B-52s, fighters, everything. Nothing made me as nervous as the Blackbirds. They were beautiful airplanes, but unforgiving. Chapter 4. When the system failed. The SR-71 refueling system did fail, repeatedly. The Air Force did not publicize these incidents at the time, but they are documented in classified after-action reports that have since been declassified under Freedom of Information Act requests. On June 17, 1971, An SR-71 flying from Kadena Air Base toward the Soviet Far East lost contact with its second refueling tanker over the Sea of Japan. Weather had forced the tanker off its assigned track. A line of thunderstorms had moved through the refueling area, and air traffic control had diverted the tanker north to avoid severe turbulence. The tanker crew radioed the SR-71 with the updated coordinates, but the message was garbled by atmospheric interference. The SR-71 crew pilot Major Harold Adams and reconnaissance systems officer Captain William Macherek had enough fuel to search for the tanker for approximately 8 minutes before they would have to abort and return to Kadena. They found the tanker on the 9th minute, 12 miles south of its planned position, orbiting at 2,600 feet instead of the brief 28,000. Adams descended to meet the tanker, joined on the boom, and took on fuel. But by the time they completed the refueling, they had burned into their reserve fuel, the cushion that mission planners built into every sortie to account for contingencies. Adams radioed Kadena Command and reported the situation. The mission commander ordered them to continue, but cut the final surveillance leg short. They photographed Soviet naval facilities at Vladivostok and submarine pens on the Kamchatka Peninsula, but they skipped the planned pass over the Kuril Islands and returned to Kadena early. The after-action report noted that the mission achieved 60% of its intelligence objectives. The missing imagery from the Kurils had to be collected by satellite, which took 3 more days and provided lower resolution. On April 2000, 1973, an SR-71 flying from Mildenhall toward the Baltic Sea experienced a fuel pump failure during the third refueling. The mission was a standard Baltic reconnaissance run, photographing Soviet naval activity in the Gulf of Finland. The SR-71 had completed 2 refuelings successfully, one after departure from Mildenhall, one over the North Sea. The third refueling was scheduled over the Norwegian Sea, north of the Shetland Islands. The tanker was on station, fuel flow initiated normally, and everything looked routine. Then 8 minutes into the offload, the tanker's fuel pump seized. The pump seized mechanically. A bearing failed, the shaft locked up, and fuel flow stopped instantly. The boom operator saw the pressure gauges drop to 0. He called the disconnect, but by then the SR-71 had received only £22,000 of the planned £45,000 offload. The SR-71 pilot, Captain James Watkins, calculated his fuel state. He had enough to reach the surveillance area, but not enough to complete the mission and return to Mildenhall. He declared an emergency, diverted to Bodo Air Station in Norway, and landed with less than £5,000 of fuel remaining, barely enough for one approach and landing with minimal reserve. The airplane sat at Bodo for 3 days while maintenance crews flew in from Mildenhall to replace the failed fuel pump. During those 3 days, the Soviet naval activity that the mission was supposed to monitor went unobserved. Intelligence analysts later determined that a Soviet nuclear submarine had transited from Murmansk to the Baltic during that window, undetected by US surveillance assets. The submarine was a new Yankee-class boat on its first patrol, and analysts wanted baseline acoustic signatures for future tracking. That opportunity was lost. On September 14, 1970-75, an SR-71, flying from Biel toward the Arctic Circle, lost an engine during climb-out after the departure refueling. One J-58 simply quit. Later investigation revealed a fuel control valve had stuck closed due to contamination in the fuel system. The crew shut down the failed engine and attempted to continue the mission on one engine, but a single J-58 could not maintain altitude above 70,000 feet, and the airplane could not achieve Mach 3. Maximum altitude on one engine was approximately 60,000 feet. Maximum speed was Mach 2.4. The mission, a high-priority surveillance run over Soviet ballistic missile submarine operating areas in the Arctic Ocean, required 80,000 feet and Mach 3 to stay outside the engagement envelope of Soviet SA-5 surface-to-air missiles deployed along the northern coast. At 60,000 feet and Mach 2.4, the SR-71 would have been vulnerable. The crew aborted and returned to Biel. The mission was reflown 3 days later by a different crew, in a different airplane. By then, the submarine activity that prompted the mission had ended. The Soviets had completed whatever exercise or patrol they were conducting and returned to port. These failures did not involve enemy action. They were logistics failures, weather, mechanical problems, and timing errors, the kinds of mundane difficulties that affect all aircraft operations. But for the SR-71, these mundane difficulties were existential threats. The airplane had no margin. It operated at the edge of its performance envelope on every mission. Any degradation, engine failure, fuel leak, navigation error, weather divert pushed it beyond that envelope, forcing an abort. The Air Force calculated that roughly 12% of planned SR-71 sorties aborted before reaching the primary surveillance area. This figure is documented in a 1976 Strategic Air Command analysis of SR-71 mission effectiveness. Of those aborts, approximately 60% were due to refueling problems, tanker unavailability, fuel transfer failures, weather delays that threw the timing off, navigation errors that put the tanker in the wrong location. The airplane's vulnerability was not missiles, it was the schedule, and the schedule was unforgiving. Every SR-71 sortie was planned months in advance, tankers had to be allocated, crews had to be trained, fuel had to be pre-positioned, flight paths had to be coordinated with Allied air traffic control authorities. If any element failed, if a tanker went down for maintenance, if a crew called in sick, if weather closed the refueling track, the mission slipped, sometimes by days, sometimes by weeks. And intelligence is a perishable commodity. What matters today may be irrelevant next week. Chapter 5. The Hidden Advantage. Unpredictability through refueling. What the Soviets did not fully grasp, what Western analysts did not fully articulate until years after the SR-71 retired, was that the tanker choreography itself was a weapon, not a kinetic weapon, an operational weapon that created unpredictability. Soviet air defense doctrine assumed that reconnaissance aircraft followed predictable routes. This assumption was rooted in experience with the U-2. The U-2 flew straight-line missions at constant altitude. It had limited range and had to fly direct routes from base to target and back. Soviet radar operators learned to predict where a U-2 would appear based on where it had been detected previously. This predictability made interception feasible. By the time Gary Powers was shot down in 1960, Soviet air defense forces had developed standard procedures for U-2 intercepts: track the target from initial detection, calculate its course and speed, position surface-to-air missile batteries along the projected flight path, and fire salvos when the target entered range. The system worked. Powers was hit by an SA-2 missile that detonated near his aircraft, causing catastrophic damage. He ejected and was captured. The mission ended Soviet manned overflights of Soviet territory for the rest of the Cold War. The SR-71 defeated this doctrine not through speed alone, but through unpredictability enabled by mid-air refueling. Consider a typical operational profile. An SR-71 launched from Mildenhall towards Soviet territory did not fly a straight line from England to the target. Instead, it flew a complex dogleg route, north over the Norwegian Sea, refueling twice en route, then east toward the Barents Sea, then south along the Soviet coastline, photographing naval facilities and radar installations, then west again over the Baltic, refueling once more, and finally back to Mildenhall. The entire route covered more than 4,000 miles and took approximately 4 hours. But from a Soviet perspective, the route was chaotic. The airplane appeared, disappeared, reappeared in unexpected locations, changed altitude and speed unpredictably, and never flew a straight line long enough for Soviet air defenses to establish a reliable track. Soviet radar operators tracked the airplane, or tried to. The SR-71 appeared on radar intermittently, depending on altitude, speed, and the performance of Soviet early warning systems. Soviet radar had difficulty maintaining consistent track on the Blackbird for several reasons. First, the airplane's small radar cross-section made it hard to detect at long range. The SR-71 was not a stealth aircraft in the modern sense. It did not use radar-absorbent materials or faceted surfaces, but its narrow fuselage and smooth contours minimized radar returns. Second, the SR-71's high altitude placed it near the edge of most Soviet radar coverage. Early warning radars could detect the airplane, but tracking radars had difficulty maintaining lock. Third, the SR-71's high speed meant that radar operators had only seconds to acquire the target, calculate a firing solution, and launch missiles before the airplane moved out of range. But even when detected, the airplane's course was impossible to predict with certainty. It did not fly straight lines. It maneuvered, climbing, descending, turning, based on intelligence priorities and tanker availability. The refuelings themselves were invisible to Soviet radar because they occurred over neutral or Allied-controlled airspace, typically 300 to 400 miles from Soviet borders. From a Soviet perspective, the airplane simply vanished for 15 to 20 minutes, then reappeared on a completely different heading. This forced Soviet air defenses into a reactive posture. By the time they detected an SR-71 and calculated an intercept, the airplane had often already completed its surveillance pass and turned away. Surface-to-air missiles fired at the Blackbird typically arrived at empty sky. The airplane had already moved beyond the missile's effective range. Soviet doctrine called for firing salvos, multiple missiles launched in quick succession to cover the target's projected flight path. But, if the projection was wrong, all missiles missed. and the SR-71's unpredictable routing made accurate projection nearly impossible. Declassified Soviet air defense records from the 1970s and 80s, released by the Russian government in the late 1990s, show that Soviet forces fired over 1,000 surface-to-air missiles at SR-71s during the airplane's operational career. Not one missile connected. Soviet reports attribute some misses to technical failures, missiles that did not guide properly, warheads that did not detonate, but the majority of misses were due to inaccurate targeting. The missiles arrived at the predicted intercept point, but the SR-71 was not there. It had turned, climbed, descended, or simply continued past the point faster than the missile flight time allowed. The tanker pre-positioning was what made this unpredictability possible. Without aerial refueling, the SR-71 would have been constrained to flying direct routes from base to target, and back, exactly the kind of predictable profile that Soviet doctrine could counter. With aerial refueling, the airplane could fly indirect routes, vary its approach angles, and exploit gaps in Soviet radar coverage. The tankers turned the SR-71 from a fast point-to-point reconnaissance platform into a highly maneuverable, persistent sensor that could loiter near Soviet borders, collect intelligence, and depart before Soviet forces could react effectively. In a 1988 study conducted by the RAND Corporation for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, analysts concluded that the SR-71's survivability against advanced Soviet air defenses was due less to its speed than to its operational flexibility. The study noted that Soviet SA-5 and SA-10 surface-to-air missiles, introduced in the late 1970s and early 1980s, had theoretical engagement envelopes that overlapped the SR-71's operational altitude and speed range. The SA-5 Gammon, in particular, was designed specifically to intercept high-altitude, high-speed targets. It had a maximum range of approximately 200 miles and a maximum altitude of 90,000 feet. Its warhead was large enough to destroy the SR-71 with a near miss, but achieving an actual intercept required accurate prediction of the target's future position. Soviet missile guidance systems in the 1970s used semi-active radar homing. The missile followed radar energy reflected off the target. If the target maneuvered, the guidance system had to adjust. But the adjustment took time, several seconds for the missile's onboard computer to process the new trajectory and command the control surfaces. Against a Mach 3 target, those seconds translated to miles of error. And if the target turned sharply, the missile could not keep up. Its turn radius at high altitude was measured in tens of miles. The SR-71 could turn inside that radius, forcing the missile to overshoot. The RAND study concluded that the SR-71's unpredictable routing, enabled by flexible tanker support, reduced the probability of a successful intercept by approximately 80% compared to a predictable route. In other words, Soviet air defenses that might have achieved a 20% hit rate against a straight-line target achieved only a 4% hit rate against an SR-71 flying an indirect, tanker-enabled route. The tankers did not just extend the airplane's range, they multiplied its survivability. Chapter 6. The Proof. Operation Giant Reach. The clearest demonstration of the SR-71's tanker-dependent operational model, and the operational advantage the dependence created, came during Operation Giant Reach in 1986. In April 1986, tensions between the United States and Libya escalated following a series of terrorist attacks linked to Libyan intelligence services. On April 5, a bomb exploded in a West Berlin nightclub frequented by USC service members, killing 3 people and wounding 229. Intelligence intercepts traced the attack to Libyan operatives. President Ronald Reagan authorized military strikes against Libyan targets in retaliation. The strikes, Operation El Dorado Canyon, were planned for mid-April, targeting Libyan air defense sites, airfields, and suspected terrorist training camps. Before the strikes, the Pentagon needed current intelligence on Libyan air defenses. Satellite imagery was available but insufficient. The imagery was days old. Radar sites and missile batteries moved frequently. Strike planners needed precise real-time locations to minimize the risk to attacking aircraft. The SR-71 was the obvious choice, but there was a problem. Libya was far from any SR-71 operating base. Mildenhall in England was over 2,000 miles from Tripoli. Beale in California was on the wrong side of the planet, and Kadena in Okinawa had no operational reason to deploy to the Mediterranean. The solution was Operation Giant Reach, a round-trip SR-71 sortie from Mildenhall to Libya and back, covering more than 5,000 miles in under 6 hours with 9 aerial refuelings. The mission planners briefed it as the longest SR-71 sortie ever attempted. It was also one of the most complex, requiring coordination between 4 separate Air Force commands and precise timing of tanker positioning over 3 time zones. The mission launched on April 12, 1986. 3 days before the strikes, The SR-71 crew pilot Major Brian Schull and reconnaissance systems officer Major Walter Watson took off from Mildenhall at 3:15 local time. They refueled twice over the North Sea, then turned south over France. France had denied overflight permission for the strike aircraft, but the SR-71 flew above French airspace, technically in international airspace at 80,000 feet. French radar tracked the airplane but did not challenge it. Two more refuelings over the Western Mediterranean, both at night, both in weather. The tankers orbited over international waters, lit only by their refueling lights. Schull and Watson joined on the boom by instruments, took on fuel, and continued south. By the time they reached the Libyan coast, they were at Mach 3.1 and 82,000 feet. The cameras activated automatically. The optical bar cameras began scanning the ground, recording every radar site, every missile battery, every aircraft shelter at Tripoli and Benghazi airfields. The electro-optical sensors recorded heat signatures from radar transmitters and mobile missile launchers. The electronic intelligence suite recorded radar frequencies, pulse repetition rates, and tracking patterns. The entire surveillance pass lasted 11 minutes. Libyan radar detected the airplane immediately. Libyan air defense forces went on full alert. Multiple SAE-5 surface-to-air missile batteries launched missiles. Schull saw the smoke trails behind them, white streaks climbing through the sky, accelerating toward their altitude. Watson counted at least 6 missiles, possibly more. The missiles were visible for perhaps 10 seconds before they detonated behind and below the SR-71. None came close. The SR-71 was simply too fast. By the time the missiles reached 80,000 feet, the airplane was already 30 miles farther along its track. The missiles detonated harmlessly, their fragmentation wired shredding empty sky. Schull later described the moment in his memoir, Sled Driver. "We watched the missiles climb towards us. They looked slow from our altitude, but I knew they were moving at over Mach 3. Walter called them out. 6 o'clock low, climbing, still climbing. They're going to detonate low." And they did. Big orange fireballs behind us, maybe 10,000 feet low. We didn't maneuver. We just kept going. We were faster than they were, and we had altitude advantage. There was nothing they could do. After the surveillance pass, the SR-71 turned west and climbed to maximum altitude, 85,000 feet, using the Earth's curvature to break radar lock. Libyan radar lost track of the airplane as it descended below their radar horizon. 3 more refuelings on the return leg, over the Mediterranean, over southern France, and finally, over the English Channel. The airplane landed at Mildenhall at 9:12 local time, 6 hours after departure. Schull and Watson climbed out of the cockpit, exhausted and dehydrated. Pressure suits are uncomfortable for 6-hour missions, but satisfied. The mission was a complete success. The reconnaissance data was processed within 2 hours. Photo interpreters examined the optical imagery, identifying every radar site, every missile battery, every aircraft, every vehicle. Electronic warfare specialists analyzed the signal's intelligence, cataloging radar frequencies and tracking patterns. By mid-afternoon on April 12, strike planners had a complete, current picture of Libyan air defenses. The imagery showed that Libya had repositioned several CA-5 batteries since the most recent satellite pass. Without the SR-71 mission, those batteries would have been in unexpected locations, potentially threatening the strike aircraft. The El Dorado Canyon strikes 3 days later hit their targets with high precision. F-11 bombers from England and carrier-based aircraft struck Libyan radar sites, airfields, and military installations. Losses were minimal. One was lost to unknown causes, possibly to a surface-to-air missile, possibly to mechanical failure. But the strike succeeded in large part because the SR-71 imagery had provided exact coordinates for Libyan air defense sites. Strike planners routed the attack aircraft around the most dangerous threats and allocated jamming aircraft to suppress the radars they could not avoid. But the real lesson of Giant Reach was not the imagery. It was the demonstration that the SR-71 could fly essentially anywhere, on short notice, if tanker support was available. The airplane was not limited by its range. It was limited only by the Air Force's ability to position tankers along the route. Mildenhall to Libya was more than 2,000 miles. The SR-71's unrefueled range was approximately 1,200 miles at high altitude. Without tankers, the mission would have been impossible. With tankers, it was routine, or as routine as any SR-71 mission could be. In the after-action report, declassified in 2006, the mission planners noted that Giant Reach required coordination between 4 separate Air Force commands: Strategic Air Command, United States Air Forces in Europe, Tactical Air Command, and Military Airlift Command. The 9 tankers involved in the mission came from 3 different bases and flew holding patterns at 9 precise locations, timed to within 2-minute windows. Each tanker crew had to navigate to their assigned position, accounting for winds aloft, and arrive on schedule. Any delay would have cascaded through the chain, potentially forcing the SR-71 to abort. One tanker experienced a fuel pump malfunction during pre-flight and was grounded. The mission planners had anticipated this possibility and had assigned an airborne spare, a backup tanker that launched from Mildenhall 30 minutes after the primary tanker and orbited nearby, ready to take over if the primary failed. When the primary tanker went down, the spare took its position in the refueling chain. The spare tanker reached its assigned position with less than 3 minutes to spare before the SR-71 arrived. If the spare had been delayed, by weather, by mechanical problems, by navigation errors, the mission would have aborted and the El Dorado Canyon strikes would have proceeded without current intelligence on Libyan air defenses. The planners would have relied on satellite imagery, which was days old and incomplete. The strike aircraft would have faced higher risk. Losses might have been higher. The after-action report concluded that Operation Giant Reach demonstrated the strategic value of the SR-71 but also highlighted its logistical vulnerability. The mission succeeded because everything went right. The weather was acceptable. The tankers arrived on time. The airplane performed flawlessly, but any failure, any weather delay, any tanker malfunction, any engine problem would have ended the mission. The report recommended that future long-range SR-71 missions include even more backup tankers and expand the timing windows to allow for contingencies. The recommendations were noted, but not implemented. The cost was too high. Chapter 7. Conclusion. The scoreboard and the permanent change. The SR-71 flew its final operational mission on March 6, 1990. By then, the airplane had logged more than 17,000 sorties over 24 years. Not one had been lost to enemy action. The Soviets had fired over 1,000 surface-to-air missiles at SR-71S over the years. None connected. The airplane's operational record was flawless from a survivability standpoint. But the record concealed a deeper truth. The SR-71's effectiveness was entirely dependent on a logistical infrastructure that consumed enormous resources and offered zero operational margin. The public narrative credited the airplane's speed. The operational reality was more complex. Speed mattered, but so did the refueling choreography that enabled unpredictable routing, persistent surveillance, and rapid global reach. The SR-71 was not invulnerable because it was too fast to catch. It was effective because the tanker force made it operationally flexible enough to exploit gaps in enemy defenses and complete missions before those defenses could respond. The cost was staggering and ultimately unsustainable. Each SR-71 sortie required an average of 5 tanker aircraft, 22 aircrew members, and over 400,000 pounds of JP-7 fuel. The Strategic Air Command calculated that the total cost per flight hour for an SR-71, including tanker support, maintenance, crew training, and infrastructure, exceeded $85,000 in 1980 dollars, equivalent to roughly $200,000 in current terms. By comparison, a typical reconnaissance satellite in the same period cost approximately $10 million to launch, but could collect imagery continuously for 2 to 3 years without refueling, without tanker support, and without risking aircrew. When the Air Force retired the SR-71 in 1990, the official justification was that satellites and unmanned aerial vehicles could perform the same missions at lower cost and without risking aircrew. This was partly true. Satellite imagery had improved dramatically since the 1960s. The KH-11 reconnaissance satellites, introduced in the late 1970s, provided near real-time imagery with resolution comparable to SR-71 optical cameras. Unmanned aerial vehicles like the Lockheed D-21 drone and later the General Atomics Predator could loiter over target areas for hours, collecting persistent surveillance that the SR-71 could not match. The technology had advanced. The SR-71's unique advantages, speed and altitude, mattered less in an era of high-resolution satellites and long-endurance drones. But the real reason for retirement was simpler and more prosaic. The Air Force could not sustain the tanker support burden. The KC-135Q fleet was aging. The airframes had been in service since the early 1960s. Fatigue cracks were appearing in wing spars and fuselage frames. Maintenance costs were rising, and JP-7 production had ended in the mid-1980s. The remaining stockpiles would last only a few more years. The Air Force would have had to restart JP-7 production, a complex chemical process involving specialized refining equipment, or ground the SR-71 fleet. Restarting production was estimated to cost over $100 million. The Air Force decided that the cost was not justified for an airplane that was becoming increasingly marginal as satellite and unmanned capabilities improved. And the Strategic Air Command needed its tanker resources for other missions. The KC-135Q fleet was small, only 56 aircraft, but it consumed disproportionate maintenance and logistical effort. Each Q model required specialized training for boom operators and maintenance crews. Each required separate fuel handling equipment. Each required dedicated storage facilities for JP7, and each KC-135Q that was dedicated to SR-71 support was one fewer tanker available for bomber operations, fighter refueling, and global mobility missions. As the Cold War wound down in the late 1980s, the Air Force was under pressure to reduce costs and eliminate redundant capabilities. The SR-71, despite its legendary status, was an obvious target. The SR-71 community had known from the beginning that the airplane was a logistics system as much as it was a reconnaissance platform. The airplane itself was a marvel of engineering, but it was useless without the tankers, the fuel, the ground crews, the maintenance facilities, and the operational infrastructure that kept it flying. What they discovered over 2 decades of operations was that logistics systems are more fragile than airframes. The airplane could survive hostile fire, extreme temperatures, mechanical failures, and pilot error, but it could not survive a fuel shortage, a tanker malfunction, or a timing error that left it stranded mid-mission with empty tanks. In the end, the SR-71's operational record validated both the myth and the reality. The airplane was, in fact, too fast for Soviet interceptors and surface-to-air missiles to catch under normal circumstances. But that speed depended on an aerial refueling ballet, choreographed to the minute, executed by dozens of tanker crews, and vulnerable to 100 different failure modes. The myth said it outran missiles by luck and speed alone. The reality was that it outplanned them with fuel, timing, and operational flexibility, enabled by mid-air refueling. And when the fuel ran out, when the Air Force could no longer justify the cost of sustaining the tanker force and the fuel supply chain, the mission ended, not because the airplane failed, but because the logistics finally did. The lesson was not lost on military planners. Modern stealth aircraft, the B-2 Spirit bomber, the F-22 Raptor fighter, the F-35 Lightning II strike fighter, all prioritize aerial refueling compatibility. Their range exceeds that of previous generations, but they still depend on tanker support for global reach. The B-2, for instance, has an unrefueled range of approximately 6,000 miles, but its combat missions often require multiple refuelings to reach targets on the other side of the world and return safely. The F-22 and F-35 have even shorter ranges, less than 2,000 miles unrefueled, and are essentially non-operational for anything beyond defensive patrols without tanker support. The SR-71 proved that speed and stealth mean little without the logistics to sustain operations. It proved that the real weapon is not always the platform you see, but the support infrastructure that keeps it flying. It proved that operational flexibility, the ability to vary routes, change altitudes, and exploit gaps in enemy defenses, is often more important than raw performance. And it proved that logistics can be both an enabler and a constraint. The same tanker force that gave the SR-71 its operational advantage also made it vulnerable. When the tankers were available, the airplane was nearly invincible. When the tankers were not available, the airplane was grounded. And it proved something else, that the most dangerous vulnerabilities are not the ones your enemies exploit, but the ones you build into your own operational doctrine because you have no other choice. The SR-71 community built an airplane that could not operate without constant aerial refueling. They accepted that dependency because the airplane's performance advantages were worth the logistical burden. They built a logistics system to support it: tankers, fuel, crews, infrastructure. And they succeeded for 24 years in making that system work well enough that the airplane never failed in combat. But they always knew. Standing in those operations rooms, watching the tanker status boards, calculating fuel margins, that the mission did not start when the airplane took off. It started when the tankers launched. And it ended not when the airplane landed, but when the last tanker returned safely to base, having delivered the fuel that made speed possible. The SR-71 was the star. The tankers were the stage crew. And like any theatrical production, the show could not go on if the crew did not show up. In 2025, 35 years after the SR-71's retirement, the lessons remain relevant. The United States military is more dependent on aerial refueling than ever. The Air Force's tanker fleet is aging. The KC-135, which entered service in the 1950s, is still the backbone of the refueling force. The KC-46 Pegasus, the intended replacement, has been plagued by technical problems and cost overruns. And potential adversaries, China, Russia, are developing long-range anti-access weapons designed to threaten tanker aircraft operating near their borders. The SR-71's vulnerability was logistical. Modern air power's vulnerability may be the same. The platforms are impressive, the logistics that sustain them are fragile. And in a future conflict, the side that protects its logistics its tankers, its fuel supply chains, its maintenance infrastructure, may be the side that wins, regardless of whose airplanes are faster or stealthier. The SR-71 Blackbird flew higher and faster than any other operational aircraft. It collected intelligence that shaped Cold War strategy. It intimidated adversaries and reassured allies. But its legacy is not just technological. Its legacy is operational. The understanding that capability without sustainability is hollow, that speed without fuel is useless, and that the most critical weapon in any air campaign may be the one that never fires a shot, the tanker, delivering gas, making everything else possible.